The police officer put his hands on the wrong black woman in the courthouse, thinking he could intimidate and arrest her simply because he could. He didn't know, and couldn't even imagine, that the woman he chose to unleash his prejudice upon was a high-ranking FBI official. What happened to that racist cop just minutes later shocked everyone who witnessed it, shaking the entire courthouse to its core and changing the course of many careers forever. It all started on a tense Monday morning, when the halls of the courthouse buzzed with a heavy, cold energy. A sentencing hearing was underway, involving a young black defendant accused of resisting arrest. The courtroom was packed with police officers, family members, reporters, and observers. The woman stood silently at the back, dressed professionally, calm, collected, radiating quiet power. But to a certain officer, all he saw was skin color. All he saw was someone to target, someone to make an example of. All he saw was a black woman who, in his mind, didn't belong there. As the officer approached her, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. It was as if the air itself grew heavier, charged with the tension of an injustice about to unfold. Without warning, he grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back. Gasps echoed across the room as people turned to watch. "Where's your badge, huh? You think you can just walk around here looking suspicious without consequences?" His voice was loud, cutting through the solemn quiet of the courtroom. The woman kept her composure, her eyes burning with something fierce yet controlled. She didn't resist. She didn't need to. Instead, she calmly said, "Take your hands off me. Right now." The officer laughed, a short, ugly sound that made many people in the room shift uncomfortably. "Oh, so you think you're somebody important? Around here, you're just another criminal waiting for your turn." The entire room froze. People looked at each other, unsure if they were about to witness an arrest, a fight, or something much worse. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order, but the officer didn't flinch. He thought he was in control. He thought he was the authority. What he didn't know was that his hands were on the very person who outranked every law enforcement official in the building. He didn't know that the woman he was trying to humiliate had the power to dismantle his entire career with a single phone call. He didn't know that she had been sent there precisely to observe cases like this, to catch injustices exactly like this, red-handed. As the officer tightened his grip, shoving her toward the wall in front of the shocked audience, she remained calm, almost eerily so. Murmurs started to rise among the crowd, a growing wave of discontent. Reporters started filming. Attorneys whispered urgently among themselves. Even some of the other officers looked uneasy, realizing that something was very wrong. And then, with the precision of a professional long used to commanding entire operations, the woman slowly turned her head toward the judge and said in a steady, commanding voice, "Your Honor, I suggest you intervene before this officer's actions escalate further." The judge, who until now had sat stiffly behind the bench, blinked as if waking up from a dream. She glanced at the woman's face, at her badge discreetly revealed under her jacket, and her eyes widened in recognition. The judge slammed her gavel again, harder this time, her voice sharp and urgent. "Officer, release her immediately." The officer, confused, looked around for support, finding none. His face paled slightly, but pride and arrogance kept him rooted in place. "She doesn't belong here," he muttered under his breath. The woman didn't need to say another word. She simply stood there, straightening her jacket, eyes locked onto the officer with a calm that was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. For a split second, everything hung in the air, the ignorance, the humiliation, the prejudice laid bare for everyone to see. And just as quickly, the atmosphere shifted again. Men in dark suits appeared from the back of the courtroom, moving with coordinated precision. Federal agents. Silent witnesses who had been watching everything unfold. They weren't here by accident. They had been waiting for this moment, documenting everything, prepared to act the second the truth revealed itself. The officer's fate was already sealed the moment he touched her, but he just didn't know it yet. People in the gallery leaned forward, breathless. Reporters raised their cameras higher. Lawyers dropped their pens. The young defendant, sitting with his head down moments earlier, lifted his eyes, hope flickering across his face. Something unprecedented was about to happen. A reckoning that had been long overdue. A moment when the system would be forced to look at itself and answer for its own rot. And all because one man, drunk on his own unchecked power, chose the wrong woman to harass. What happens next would not only change the course of the officer's life forever but also send shockwaves through the police department, the city, and far beyond. But how exactly did the tables turn so quickly? How did a simple courtroom hearing turn into a moment of national outrage? And what final, devastating move would the woman make to ensure that justice was not only served, but seen? Stay with us to witness a story of humiliation, strength, and an unforgettable lesson in true power. The kind of story that will leave you speechless. The kind of story that proves, sometimes, karma doesn't wait. Sometimes, it walks right through the courtroom doors, wearing a badge. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or injustice. You matter. Your voice matters. Your story matters. We are proud to use this platform to amplify stories that reflect strength, dignity, and justice. Thank you for being here. Now, get ready for a powerful and emotional story. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist and be part of this journey with us. Her name was Simone Carter, and in many ways, she was an anomaly in every room she ever entered. Born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, Simone carried with her the weight of generations who had fought silently, defiantly, for the place she now occupied in the world. Her mother, a public school teacher, had always believed in the dignity of knowledge. Her father, a postal worker who never missed a day of work, had taught her that real strength was quiet, steady, and unshakable. From a young age, Simone understood the subtle and overt obstacles that stood in her way, but she never allowed them to define her. Instead, she crafted herself like a weapon, sharp, polished, resilient. By the time she was 35, Simone had already risen to one of the highest operational roles within the FBI, a position earned through relentless dedication, not favors, not shortcuts. She was known for her cool, strategic mind and for her unbreakable composure under pressure. Those who underestimated her rarely did so twice. On that heavy morning in Detroit, Michigan, the air was thick with unease even before Simone stepped into the Wayne County Courthouse. The building itself was an aging structure, its marble floors scuffed and its high ceilings echoing the weariness of decades of trials and tears. It was the kind of place where history hung in the walls, where justice often walked a crooked path, weighed down by bias and bureaucracy. Simone entered the courthouse unnoticed by most, blending into the background intentionally, a master observer. Her presence there was deliberate, a quiet operation to monitor ongoing cases involving allegations of police misconduct. She was gathering evidence, patterns, behaviors, not for the public eye, not yet. Her methods were subtle because the truth, she had learned, could not always be shouted into existence. Sometimes, it had to be exposed in a trap of its own making. The courtroom was filled with tension as people filed in for the sentencing hearing of a young man accused of resisting arrest. On one side sat the defendant's family, their faces lined with worry and exhaustion. On the other side were officers in uniform, their posture rigid, their gazes hard and judgmental. Among them stood Officer Daniel Whitaker, a man whose career was built more on intimidation than integrity. He was known for his aggressive tactics, the countless complaints swept neatly under rugs, the promotions earned more by alliances than merit. Tall, stocky, with a jaw perpetually clenched as if he were bracing for a fight, Whitaker exuded the kind of power that thrived in the shadows, unchallenged and unrepentant. Simone found a seat at the back, perfectly positioned to observe without drawing attention. She wore a simple navy blazer, dark slacks, and a white blouse, professional yet unremarkable to the casual eye. Her natural curls framed her face, and her expression was a mask of neutrality. She listened intently as the proceedings began, noting the subtle tensions, the coded language used by the prosecution, the way the officers in the gallery smirked during certain testimonies. Every detail was a thread in a much larger web Simone had been weaving for months. The moment that would change everything came not from the defendant or the attorneys, but from Officer Whitaker himself. His eyes swept the room, landing on Simone with a spark of disdain. To him, she was just another face, another outsider, another problem to control. He moved through the courtroom with the swagger of someone who believed they owned the ground they walked on. Without a second thought, he approached her, his voice low but laced with threat as he demanded to know why she was there. Simone met his gaze calmly, her badge hidden beneath her jacket, her credentials tucked away, invisible to those who only saw the surface. When she refused to answer his aggressive questions, when she dared to remain silent and composed, Whitaker's arrogance exploded. He grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it with a grip designed to inflict both pain and humiliation. Around them, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The air grew electric with disbelief. "You don't belong here," Whitaker sneered, his voice loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. "You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want? Not on my watch." His hand tightened cruelly as he tried to drag her out of her seat. Simone's heart pounded, but her face remained an unreadable mask. She had been trained for moments like this, though nothing could erase the sting of public humiliation, the searing injustice of being reduced to a threat simply because of the color of her skin. She stood up slowly, deliberately, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her struggle. Every eye in the room was now on them, the silent courtroom bearing witness to the ugliness laid bare. Reporters clutched their phones, some filming discreetly. Attorneys muttered in alarm. Even the judge, a stern woman who prided herself on neutrality, looked uncertain, her gavel frozen midair. Whitaker's fellow officers shifted uneasily but said nothing, their silence screaming complicity. He was their brother, their reflection, and none dared to cross him. But Whitaker had made one critical mistake: he believed his power was absolute. He believed he could humiliate anyone he chose, without consequence. And he had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. Simone locked eyes with the judge, her voice cutting through the heavy silence with chilling clarity. "Your Honor, I respectfully request your immediate intervention." The judge hesitated, confusion flickering across her face, then realization dawning. Simone allowed her jacket to fall open slightly, revealing a glimpse of her badge, the badge that outranked every single officer in that room. The shift in atmosphere was almost audible. A collective inhalation, a shuddering ripple of disbelief. Whitaker faltered, his grip loosening slightly, confusion clouding his features. But it was too late. The damage was done. The world had seen. The courthouse had witnessed. And soon, far more eyes would be watching. Simone straightened her shoulders, ignoring the throbbing ache in her arm, and prepared herself for what would come next. She knew this was bigger than her. It was about every time a black woman had been silenced, dismissed, brutalized. It was about a system that believed it could trample dignity without consequence. The judge slammed her gavel down hard, her voice rising above the stunned silence, ordering Officer Whitaker to release the woman immediately. He hesitated, pride and fear battling within him, but compliance was no longer optional. As he stepped back, hands trembling slightly, Simone fixed him with a gaze so unflinching, so devastatingly calm, that it pierced through the armor of arrogance he had so carefully constructed over the years. From the corners of the courtroom, several men in plain suits began to move forward, men Simone had placed strategically to observe, record, and act. Whitaker noticed too late. His fate was already spiraling out of his control, unraveling faster than he could comprehend. And yet, even now, even as his career teetered on the edge of destruction, Whitaker clung to the belief that he was the victim, not the perpetrator. The walls of the courthouse, witnesses to decades of injustices swept under tattered rugs, stood silently as history shifted before them. This time, there would be no quiet cover-up. No whispered apologies behind closed doors. The reckoning had arrived, swift and undeniable. But how deep would the consequences cut? How far would the truth ripple outward? And how would a single moment of prejudice spark a chain reaction that no one, not even Simone, could fully predict? In the days to come, names would be exposed, careers would crumble, and the facade of invincibility surrounding a broken system would shatter under the weight of undeniable evidence. But in that moment, as Simone stood in the center of the courtroom, battered but unbowed, she embodied something far greater than vengeance or anger. She was the living, breathing testament that true power does not need to announce itself. It moves silently, strikes precisely, and when it finally reveals itself, it demands to be seen. The silence that followed Officer Whitaker's reluctant release of Simone Carter was thick enough to drown in. Every eye in the room remained locked on her, as if they expected her to crumble or lash out, but Simone did neither. She simply straightened her jacket with a small, deliberate movement that spoke volumes. The judge called for a brief recess, her voice sharp and uneasy, and the murmur of conversations filled the room as people began to stand, stretching and whispering urgently to one another. Simone didn't move. She stood at the center of the storm, her body calm, but her mind was a hive of carefully calculated reactions. Whitaker lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to push the boundary further, but then turned sharply on his heel and stormed toward the exit, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Simone allowed herself a small breath, her heartbeat steadying as she scanned the room. Several plainclothes agents she had deployed earlier shifted subtly, their presence barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. They would be ready when the time came. Every moment Whitaker breathed free was one more moment he believed he had gotten away with it, and that belief was exactly what Simone needed. Arrogance was the bait, and he had bitten it deep. Still, the weight of humiliation clung to her, a reminder that no badge, no title, could shield her from the ugliness that had been normalized in places like this. She filed the emotion away, locking it behind a wall of discipline. There would be time for anger later. Right now, there was a mission to complete. As Simone made her way into the hallway, she could feel the stares following her. Some were sympathetic, others curious, and a few were openly hostile. A reporter brushed past, her phone discreetly recording as she pretended to check her messages. A pair of officers exchanged whispered comments behind cupped hands. Whitaker himself was pacing near a vending machine, barking into his phone with a furious intensity that spoke of damage control already in motion. Simone caught snippets of his conversation, overstepped, badge flashing, fake credentials, and allowed herself a tight, grim smile. He still didn't know who she really was. His ignorance would be his undoing. As she waited by the elevator, one of the young defense attorneys from the courtroom approached her, his face a portrait of conflicted emotions. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice low, respectful. I just wanted to say that what happened in there was wrong. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Simone studied him for a moment, weighing sincerity against performative guilt. His hands were shaking slightly, his gaze not quite meeting hers. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement without warmth, and turned back toward the elevator. The young man's apology was a drop in an ocean. It would take more than whispered regrets to fix what had been broken. Minutes later, back inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. Thicker. Heavier. Tension hung from the ceiling like fog. The defendants' families sat rigidly in their seats, their faces tight with fear and hope and exhaustion. The judge shuffled papers nervously at her bench, casting furtive glances toward Simone. Whitaker had returned too, standing stiffly near the prosecutors, his face flushed and tight with barely controlled rage. Simone could feel the walls closing in on him, the slow realization that something bigger than a bruised ego was unfolding around him. The judge cleared her throat and addressed the court. "Before we continue with sentencing," she began, her voice strained, "I need to address an incident that occurred during recess." All heads turned. Whitaker shifted, trying to mask his discomfort with a smirk. The judge's gaze, however, was unflinching. "An inquiry will be opened into Officer Whitaker's conduct today. Effective immediately, Officer Whitaker is relieved of duty pending investigation." Gasps erupted throughout the room, low murmurs of disbelief and satisfaction mingling in the heavy air. Whitaker's jaw dropped slightly, his face cycling rapidly through shock, disbelief, and fury. "You can't be serious," he blurted out, stepping forward. "You're going to take her word over mine?" His voice cracked at the edges, desperate and disbelieving. The judge banged her gavel once, silencing him with a look. Simone watched him carefully, noting the flush of red creeping up his neck, the wild darting of his eyes. The cracks were spreading. It was only a matter of time before the entire facade collapsed. The session continued, but the focus was shattered. No one could concentrate on the sentencing anymore. The real trial was happening outside the formal proceedings, a silent reckoning playing out in glances, whispers, and rapidly tapping phone screens. As Simone sat quietly, her presence now fully acknowledged, she noticed two uniformed officers murmuring to Whitaker near the side exit. Their expressions were tense, nervous. A plan was forming, and it didn't smell like surrender. After the session adjourned, Simone didn't head for the main exit. Instead, she slipped down a side corridor, her steps measured, her senses sharpened. Whitaker wouldn't go quietly, she knew that now. She needed to be ready. Sure enough, as she rounded the corner, she heard the heavy stomp of boots behind her, followed by a low, threatening voice. "You think you're smart, don't you? Coming in here, making me look bad?" Whitaker's voice was a mixture of venom and desperation. Simone turned slowly, facing him fully for the first time since the incident. "I didn't have to make you look bad, Officer Whitaker," she said, her voice calm and razor-sharp. "You did that all by yourself." He took a step closer, his fists clenching. For a moment, Simone saw the future unfolding, an assault, a desperate attempt to salvage pride with violence. But before he could move, before he could even breathe wrong, two agents materialized behind him, badges flashing, hands poised. "Daniel Whitaker," one agent said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "You're under investigation for civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. You are to come with us immediately." Whitaker froze, the color draining from his face. Around them, courthouse employees pretended not to watch, but their curious glances betrayed them. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a fall from grace. A public undoing. Still, even as the agents placed him in handcuffs, Whitaker twisted toward Simone, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed. Simone met his gaze without flinching. "No," she agreed, her voice low and final. "It's just beginning." As Whitaker was led away, struggling uselessly against the inevitable, Simone allowed herself a brief, quiet moment of satisfaction. This was more than personal vindication. It was the beginning of something larger. The exposure of a system that had allowed men like Whitaker to thrive unchecked for too long. And this was only the first domino to fall. Back in the courtroom, murmurs had turned to conversations, speculation spreading like wildfire. The judge ordered an official investigation into Whitaker's cases, reopening old complaints, unsealing sealed records. Reporters scrambled for statements, their pens flying across notepads, their cameras whirring. The young defense attorney who had apologized earlier approached Simone again, this time more resolutely. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you really?" He didn't finish the question, but Simone gave him a small, knowing smile. Outside, the skies above Detroit had darkened, heavy with the threat of rain. A storm was coming, not just in the clouds but in the very foundations of the courthouse itself. And Simone Carter would be at its center. She had spent years preparing for this, building cases quietly, gathering evidence meticulously, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now that moment had arrived. And no one, not Whitaker, not the corrupt systems that protected him, was ready for what was coming. The wheels of justice had been set into motion, but the journey was far from over. Secrets were about to be dragged into the light. Lives were about to be upended. And as Simone walked calmly down the courthouse steps, the first drops of rain hitting her shoulders, she knew the real battle was only beginning. But what exactly had she set in motion? And who else would be caught in the storm before it was done? The rain fell harder as Simone Carter made her way back into the courthouse, the cold water soaking into her blazer but doing nothing to cool the fire burning steadily inside her. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing within these walls, and every step she took echoed like a drumbeat of impending reckoning. The corridors were quieter now, filled only with the low hum of whispers and the click of hurried footsteps. The word had spread faster than any official notice ever could. Officers who had once walked these halls with unchecked arrogance now avoided eye contact, their faces tight with anxiety. They sensed what was coming but didn't yet understand the full scale of it. Inside the judge's private chambers, the tension was a living thing. The judge, whose authority had been challenged by the events of the day, sat rigidly at the head of a long, polished table, her hands clasped tightly together. A small group had gathered, senior officers, district attorneys, city officials, all summoned in the aftermath of Whitaker's public downfall. Simone was invited to this meeting not as a guest, but as a force. She entered the room without hesitation, her presence commanding the immediate attention of everyone inside. The judge cleared her throat, her voice brittle. "Before we proceed, I need to ask, exactly who are you, Ms. Carter?" There was a pause, a collective holding of breath, as Simone reached into her jacket and drew out her credentials with deliberate slowness, placing them on the table where everyone could see. The gold badge glinted under the fluorescent lights, and with it, the room's entire energy shifted. "My name is Special Agent Simone Carter," she said calmly, her voice slicing through the silence, "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Internal Affairs Division. I've been conducting a covert investigation into systemic misconduct within this precinct for the past 14 months. Shock rippled across the table. A senior officer, his face flushed with anger and disbelief, slammed his hand down. "You mean to tell me you've been spying on us?" Simone met his outburst with an unblinking stare. "I've been observing," she corrected, her voice steady. "And what I observed today was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a disease that has infected this courthouse, this department, and the very ideals you all claim to uphold." Another official leaned forward, his face twisted with skepticism. "You're blowing one misunderstanding out of proportion. Officer Whitaker, he made a mistake. We don't need the federal government breathing down our necks over this." Simone's smile was tight, humorless. "Mistake?" she echoed. "Whitaker's file includes over 25 complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and evidence tampering. All buried. All ignored. Today wasn't a mistake. It was the inevitable consequence of a system that has refused to police itself." The room erupted in low, angry murmurs. Simone let them speak, let the tension build until it was almost unbearable. Then she dropped the final bombshell. She slid a thick file across the table, its contents meticulously documented. "This is just the beginning," she said. "My team has compiled evidence implicating not only Officer Whitaker, but several others in this department, officers, supervisors, even legal officials. Cover-ups, false arrests, intimidation tactics, falsified reports. And thanks to today, thanks to Whitaker's hubris, we now have undeniable proof of the rot." The judge paled, flipping through the first few pages of the file, her hands trembling slightly. Across the table, the district attorney looked as if he might be sick. The realization dawned, slow and dreadful, that they were not facing an internal reprimand. They were facing an implosion. A reckoning that would dismantle careers, reputations, entire structures of authority. From the back of the room, Officer Whitaker was ushered in, still cuffed, his eyes wild with fear and rage. He caught sight of Simone and immediately lunged forward, restrained quickly by the agents flanking him. "This is a setup," he barked hoarsely. "She's lying. She's making all of this up to ruin me." Simone didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "The cameras don't lie, Officer Whitaker. The evidence doesn't lie. You did this to yourself. The judge rose slowly from her chair, her expression grim. Officer Whitaker, she said, her voice like iron wrapped in velvet, you are hereby placed under formal federal arrest for civil rights violations, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. Effective immediately, your badge, your rank, and any protections afforded to you by this court are revoked. Whitaker's mouth opened and closed, desperate for words that would save him. But there were none. Simone watched as the weight of accountability finally crashed down on a man who had spent his career believing he was untouchable. But Simone wasn't finished. She turned her gaze to the room at large, her voice rising slightly, carrying the weight of a storm that had been building long before today. The investigation will not stop here, she announced. Every case Officer Whitaker touched will be reopened. Every individual wrongfully charged or convicted based on falsified evidence will be given a chance at real justice. And every officer who aided, abetted, or remained silent in the face of injustice will be held accountable. A senior officer stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't tear this department apart, he shouted. You'll destroy everything we've built. Simone met his outburst with the same unshakable calm. If what you've built can't survive without corruption, she said quietly, then it deserves to be destroyed. For a long moment, no one spoke. The storm outside beat against the windows, as if the very heavens demanded justice too. Finally, the judge nodded once, her face resigned. Proceed, she said. As Whitaker was led away, this time not to a holding cell down the hall but to a federal transport van waiting outside, Simone followed, her steps slow, deliberate. Reporters clustered around the entrance, flashes from cameras slicing through the rain. The story would break within hours. Names would be named. Faces would be splashed across every television and phone screen in America. But for Simone, it wasn't about headlines. It was about the boy in the courtroom whose sentencing had been tainted by prejudice. It was about every person who had walked into this courthouse hoping for justice and found only corruption. Whitaker turned one last time before being loaded into the van, his voice a broken, desperate snarl. You think you've won? This system, it protects its own. You'll see. Simone's answer was simple, devastating. Not anymore. The van door slammed shut, and with it, the final echoes of Whitaker's reign. The rain poured harder now, washing the streets clean. Simone stood there for a moment, letting it soak through her clothes, her skin, her bones. It felt like a baptism. A new beginning. Back inside, the courthouse buzzed with uncertainty and fear. Officers packed up their desks quietly, some shredding documents, others making frantic phone calls. Whitaker's fall had shattered the illusion of invincibility, and now, the floodgates had opened. Whistleblowers, emboldened by Simone's stand, began to come forward. Files that had long been hidden surfaced one after another. The system wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. And Simone was ready. She had built her career for this moment, not for power, not for glory, but for justice. Real justice. Justice that didn't bend under pressure or hide behind uniforms. Justice that finally, saw every face, every voice, every life as worthy. But as she prepared for the coming battles, Simone knew the fight was far from over. The deeper she dug, the darker the truths she would uncover. Allies would become enemies. Friends would reveal betrayals. And the question she now faced wasn't whether she could win, it was how much she was willing to lose to see it through. The storm had broken. The war had begun. And nothing in Detroit would ever be the same again. The air inside the courthouse was suffocating as Simone Carter stepped back through the heavy wooden doors, the storm outside now a muted roar against the old stone walls. People parted instinctively as she walked, their conversations dropping to whispers, their eyes tracking her with a mix of awe, fear, and something deeper, a hope they had forgotten how to carry. She did not acknowledge them. Her focus was sharp, precise, as she made her way down the corridor toward the conference room where the next battle was about to unfold. This was no longer about Officer Whitaker alone. This was about everything that had been allowed to fester in the darkness, protected by silence and fear. Inside the room, the energy crackled with tension. Senior officials sat at the long table, faces drawn tight with worry, anger, and denial. A few defense attorneys who had represented countless victims over the years were there too, summoned by urgency, sensing the tectonic shift. Simone entered without hesitation, her presence immediately pulling every gaze toward her. The judge sat at the head of the table, her gavel resting unused before her, her eyes weary but resolute. The city attorney leaned forward, his voice sharp and defensive as he said, "Agent Carter, there's been enough damage today. If you continue with this witch hunt, you'll bring down more than just a few bad officers. You'll collapse public trust, you'll destroy careers, you'll ruin lives." Simone didn't flinch. She walked slowly to the center of the room, laying down another thick file on the table, the heavy thud it made echoing in the silent room. Her voice was even, but every word carried the weight of mountains. Public trust was broken long before today. Careers that thrived on injustice deserved to be destroyed. And lives were ruined the moment you decided that power was more important than truth. Across the table, one of the assistant district attorneys, a woman whose face was pale and strained, leaned forward, her voice shaking. "There are good people here. People who didn't know. People who stayed quiet because they were scared." Simone locked eyes with her, feeling the rawness of the woman's guilt vibrating off her in waves. "Silence is complicity," Simone said quietly. "Fear is understandable. But when fear becomes permission, when it enables suffering, it becomes guilt." The judge finally spoke, her voice gravelly with exhaustion. "Agent Carter, what exactly do you intend to do?" Simone turned slightly, surveying the room, making sure every soul felt the weight of her next words. "We're reopening cases, launching full federal investigations into every complaint ignored, every cover-up sanctioned. Officers involved will be suspended pending investigation. Prosecutors who participated in suppressing evidence will face disciplinary review. This courthouse, this entire department, will be audited and restructured from the ground up." She paused, letting it sink in. "And every victim will have their voice heard." A long, shuddering breath passed through the room like a ghost. Some faces turned away, unable to bear the directness of her words. Others, mostly younger staffers, lifted their heads slightly, a fragile spark of something like hope igniting in their eyes. In the corner, Detective Harold Green, a grizzled veteran with nearly 30 years on the force, spoke up, his voice rough but carrying undeniable weight. "You'll be fighting every damn inch," he said. "They're not just going to lay down. They're going to smear you, stonewall you, call you every name in the book. They'll protect their own until the last breath." Simone met his eyes, seeing not hostility, but a weary kind of respect. "Good," she said simply. "That means we're hitting where it hurts." The door creaked open and a federal agent stepped inside, nodding to Simone. She gave a small nod back. It was time. She turned back to the room. "The first arrests begin today. Subpoenas are being issued as we speak. Cooperation will be your only protection. Denial will be your downfall." Without waiting for further reaction, she turned and walked out, her stride steady, her heart pounding with adrenaline and righteous fury. Down the hall, near the holding cells, chaos had already begun. Officers who once sneered at victims now shouted at federal agents, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits, some even breaking down in tears. It was a surreal scene, men who had terrorized others now reduced to pleading and bargaining. Simone moved through them like a storm in human form, every step heavy with purpose. As she approached one of the cells, she saw Whitaker sitting on a bench, his hands cuffed in front of him now, his face bruised not from violence, but from the sheer pressure of reality crashing down around him. His eyes lifted when he saw her, burning with a hatred so raw it was almost pitiable. "You think you're a hero," he spat, his voice rough and broken. You're just another pawn. They'll replace me. They'll bury you under paperwork and politics. You'll lose. Simone leaned casually against the doorframe, her gaze cool and unbothered. Maybe, she said, her voice soft enough to force him to lean closer. Maybe they'll try. But today, you lose. Today, you answer for every life you thought you could ruin without consequence. Whitaker laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You don't get it. This city needs men like me. Without us, it'll burn. Simone's voice cut through him, sharp and clear. The only thing burning today is the lie you built your life on. She let those words hang between them, heavy and final, before turning away without another glance. Outside, under the gray skies, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their questions slicing through the air like arrows. Simone ignored them all, heading for the mobile command unit her team had set up nearby. Inside, screens displayed lists of names, maps of connections, evidence chains stretching back years. One by one, corrupt officers were being identified, summoned, arrested. It was beautiful in its precision, devastating in its scope. As she entered, one of her agents, a tall black woman named Monica Reyes, handed her a tablet. It started, Monica said, her voice low but steady. First wave of arrests complete. We've got more cooperating witnesses than we expected. Some of them are even volunteering information we didn't ask for. Simone allowed herself a rare, small smile. Good, she said. Let's keep the pressure up. No deals without full confessions. Monica hesitated, then said quietly, you know it's going to get worse before it gets better, right? They're scared. And scared men do stupid things. Simone nodded, her expression hardening. Let them. Every stupid thing they do just proves how necessary this was. Back inside the courthouse, the judge held an emergency press conference, her face grim but determined. She spoke of accountability, transparency, the painful but necessary process of rebuilding trust. Her words were careful, polished by lawyers, but Simone knew the truth, this wasn't about salvaging public image. This was survival. Later that evening, as the city's skyline flickered under stormy skies, Simone stood alone in her temporary office, overlooking the courthouse plaza. She sipped bitter coffee, her body exhausted but her mind sharp. The first battles had been won. But the war for the soul of the city was just beginning. She thought of the boy in the courtroom, the terror and hopelessness in his eyes. She thought of her father, who had warned her that real change was slow, painful, and often thankless. And she thought of every silent voice that had carried her here. The knock on her door was soft but insistent. Monica entered, her face serious. You need to see this, she said, holding out a tablet. On the screen was an anonymous message, simple but chilling. We're coming for you. Simone stared at it for a long moment, then set the tablet down. She wasn't surprised. Fearful systems always lashed out when cornered. Let them come, she said quietly. Let them see what real power looks like. The storm outside raged on, but Simone Carter stood firm, unshaken, the eye of a new kind of storm, one that would not pass quietly, one that would leave nothing untouched in its wake. The first light of dawn bled across the sky as Simone Carter stood on the steps of the courthouse, the early morning fog weaving between the columns like restless spirits. Her body ached from exhaustion, but her mind remained unyielding, cataloging every move, every decision that still needed to be made. The arrests from the night before had triggered a ripple effect unlike anything the city had seen in decades. News outlets camped outside the courthouse, broadcasting live updates to a stunned nation. Public defenders scrambled to reopen cases that had once been stamped and forgotten. Internal Affairs received a flood of anonymous tips, each one a tiny crack in the dam. The city's leadership, once confident in its own immunity, now whispered in corners, their alliances splintering under the pressure of exposure. Inside, the courthouse no longer moved with the same mechanical rhythm it once had. Officers packed their desks in silence, some under the watchful eyes of federal agents, others simply knowing it was only a matter of time before their names surfaced. Prosecutors reviewed case files with haunted expressions, realizing that their careers, built on selective justice, were now being dissected in real time. And yet, despite the small triumphs, Simone knew that victory came with a cost, and the full weight of that cost had yet to be revealed. In the command unit, Monica Reyes briefed Simone with the latest developments. Subpoenas had been issued to high-ranking officials, some of whom had already fled the city overnight. Banks were freezing accounts flagged for suspicious transactions tied to misconduct payoffs. Community activists, long dismissed by local authorities, were being called in as consultants to help restructure oversight committees. For the first time in years, real change seemed tangible. But beneath the surface, an uglier current ran unchecked. The threats against Simone had escalated overnight. Anonymous emails, texts, even a voicemail left on her personal line, cold and guttural, warning her that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Her security detail tightened accordingly, but she knew protection was a thin shield against hatred that ran deep enough to rot souls. Sitting at her desk, she scrolled through the messages without flinching. Fear was a luxury she had long since learned to live without. What rattled her, however, was not the threats but the letter that arrived with no return address, placed quietly on her chair during the night. The letter was handwritten, neat, deliberate. It spoke not of revenge, but of regret. It was from one of the very officers she had implicated, a man who admitted to falsifying reports under pressure, a man who confessed to standing by while others brutalized citizens because he was too afraid to lose everything he had worked for. He begged for forgiveness not from the system, but from the people he had failed. As Simone read the final lines, she felt the pang of the real dilemma unfolding before her, how to distinguish between the corrupted and the cowardly, between those who chose evil and those who simply chose survival. Later that morning, she met with a panel of federal officials to discuss the next steps. Tensions ran high. One official argued that the city's police department should be dismantled entirely and rebuilt from scratch. Another insisted on gradual reform, fearing chaos if the system collapsed too quickly. Simone listened, weighing their arguments, understanding that neither option was clean, neither without collateral damage. In the end, real change demanded sacrifice, but whose sacrifice it would be, the guilty or the innocent, was a question that gnawed at her. After the meeting, Simone walked the hallways of the courthouse again, watching as detainees were processed, many of them young, many of them black and brown, caught in a machine that had never been designed to protect them. She passed by a holding room and paused, seeing a young man, no older than 19, sitting with his head in his hands, his shoulders trembling. An officer she recognized from her files, one of the minor players, someone whose name surfaced in relation to falsified stops but whose participation had been passive, stood nearby, watching the boy with something close to regret in his eyes. Simone stepped inside without hesitation. The young man looked up, his eyes bloodshot, a mixture of anger and hopelessness clouding his expression. She crouched down to his level, her voice low but firm. "What's your name?" she asked. The boy hesitated before answering. "Jordan." Simone nodded. "Jordan, you're not alone in this. What they did to you, to others like you, it's not justice. It's not your fault." His lip quivered, but he said nothing, his body rigid against the vulnerability threatening to break through. The officer shifted uncomfortably, and Simone turned her gaze toward him. "Why are you still here?" she asked bluntly. He flinched as if slapped. "I didn't know how bad it was," he muttered. I thought if I just kept my head down, did my job, it would be okay." Simone rose slowly, her expression hardening. "You thought silence would protect you. It didn't protect them." She gestured toward Jordan, whose head had dropped back into his hands. The officer opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, but then closed it, shame burning across his face. Simone took a deep breath, wrestling with the urge to lash out, to strip him of the self-delusion he still clung to. Instead, she said, "You have a choice now. Tell the truth. Help fix what you helped break. Or stay silent and let the rot consume you too. As she left the holding room, Simone knew not all battles would be won in courtrooms or press conferences. Some wars were fought in the quiet spaces between pride and repentance, between self-preservation and courage. She also knew that in demanding justice, she would have to confront the uncomfortable truth that not all the guilty were monsters. Some were simply weak. That afternoon, a group of community leaders met with Simone and her team. They were wary, cautious, scarred by years of broken promises and empty rhetoric. A woman named Tanya, who had lost her son to a wrongful shooting years earlier, spoke for the group. "We don't want apologies," she said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "We want accountability. We want the people who killed our children to face the same justice they denied us." Simone nodded, feeling the immense responsibility settle even heavier on her shoulders. "We're not here to ask for forgiveness," she said. "We're here to rebuild the system so that it answers to you, not the other way around." Tanya studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't trust. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a beginning. As the day bled into evening, Simone found herself alone again, standing on the rooftop of the federal building overlooking the city. The light stretched out before her like a constellation of fragile hopes. Every name in her files, every face etched into her memory, reminded her that justice wasn't a moment, it was a lifetime of choices, of standing up even when it was easier to step aside. The dilemma gnawed at her still. How much forgiveness could she afford to give? How much cruelty deserved redemption? Were the systems she sought to dismantle built only by villains, or by good people who had simply grown tired and afraid? Could a broken city ever truly heal, or would it carry its scars forever? Behind her, Monica approached, her voice soft. "They're asking for you downstairs. The task force is ready to move to the next phase." Simone turned, feeling the exhaustion in her bones but the fire still burning in her chest. "Let's finish what we started," she said. The courthouse remained lit through the night, a beacon of fragile hope against the darkness. And as Simone Carter descended the stairs to meet the storm she had unleashed, she knew that whatever the cost, whatever the losses, she would see it through. Not because she believed the fight would be easy. But because she knew, for the first time in a long time, the fight was finally, gloriously, just. The corridors of the federal building echoed with the hushed intensity of urgent purpose as Simone Carter made her way to the lower floors where the task force gathered. Every agent there had been carefully selected for integrity, for resilience, for an unbreakable commitment to what was right over what was easy. As she entered the room, conversations tapered off and every head turned toward her. She saw the weight of expectation in their faces, the silent plea for leadership in a fight that no one else dared to lead. Monica Reyes stepped forward first, her posture rigid with resolve but her eyes betraying the deep fatigue they all shared. Simone met her gaze, offering a nod that said everything words could not. This was the moment they had built toward, and there was no turning back now. Briefing folders were distributed, filled with warrants, assignments, and directives. As Simone addressed the room, her voice was steady, the words pouring out not as orders but as shared vows. She spoke of the responsibility they carried, not just to the law but to the people the law had failed. She warned them of the resistance they would face, of the old guard clinging desperately to power. She reminded them that their strength was not in their authority but in their refusal to become what they fought against. The agents listened in rapt silence, some nodding, others clenching fists at their sides, all burning with the same fire that had kept Simone moving through sleepless nights and impossible odds. After the meeting, Simone took a moment alone in the dim hallway, letting the magnitude of what they were about to do settle into her bones. She leaned against the cool marble wall, staring at the framed photographs of officials past, knowing that some of their legacies were about to be dismantled forever. Monica joined her after a few minutes, her voice low but urgent. "Are you ready for what comes after this?" she asked, her words heavy with more than logistical concern. Simone turned her head, meeting her friend's gaze. "No," she admitted, a rare crack in her armor, but that's never been the point. Readiness doesn't change necessity. Monica nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation. The first location was a modest two-story precinct building near the city's industrial outskirts. Simone rode there in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the black SUV weaved through rain-slicked streets. The sky was still a flat, unbroken gray, as if even the heavens withheld judgment, waiting to see what would come next. When they arrived, the scene was already tense. Officers clustered defensively at the entrance, their faces a mixture of confusion, defiance, and fear. As Simone stepped out of the vehicle, several of them visibly stiffened, hands twitching toward belts where weapons hung heavy. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his voice projecting clearly over the cold morning air. "Federal warrants. Step aside." For a moment, it looked like the officers might refuse. A ripple of resistance moved through the crowd. Simone could see the calculations flickering across their faces, the desperate hope that solidarity might shield them. But when backup vehicles pulled up, more agents emerging with grim determination, the facade cracked. One by one, the officers lowered their hands and moved aside, the weight of inevitability breaking their false bravado. Inside, files were seized, computers confiscated, private offices searched under strict protocols. Simone moved through the chaos with a calm vigilance, noting the desperation in the eyes of those whose secrets were being dragged into the light. In the captain's office, she found more than she had expected, off-the-books ledgers, hidden in a locked drawer, detailing payouts, hush money, and an entire ecosystem of corruption that had been nourished for years. She turned the papers over silently to Monica, who scanned them quickly, her expression hardening. "This isn't just bad policing," Monica murmured, almost to herself. "It's organized crime wearing a badge." Outside, reporters jostled against barricades, shouting questions that no one answered. Simone paused briefly at the door, feeling their eyes on her. Part of her wanted to scream the truth into the cameras, to lay bare the rot they had uncovered, but she knew better. The truth wasn't a soundbite. It was a process, long and grueling and fraught with setbacks. She wasn't here for applause. She was here for change. That afternoon, the task force executed another set of warrants at the district attorney's office. Resistance was sharper here, more polished. Lawyers in expensive suits argued furiously, waving papers and citing obscure statutes in frantic attempts to delay the inevitable. Simone stood firm against the tide, her voice cutting through the legal jargon with the clarity of iron. "You had your chance to protect justice. You chose to protect yourselves. Now you will answer for it." The sheer exhaustion etched into the faces of the staff told her more than their words ever could. They had lived under the same rot, some complicit, some simply surviving, but all of them now forced to reckon with the reality they had ignored. By evening, Simone returned to her temporary office, the city outside a blur of flashing lights and uncertain futures. As she sifted through reports, a knock sounded at the door. Monica entered, her face unusually somber. "We have a problem," she said, setting down a file stamped with urgent priority. Simone opened it and scanned the contents, her stomach tightening. The file contained evidence suggesting that some of the officers who had agreed to cooperate were leaking information to outside parties, warning the very people Simone needed to catch off guard. Simone sat back, closing her eyes for a long moment. Betrayal was inevitable, she knew. Fear made people dangerous, and desperation made them reckless. Still, the confirmation stung, a bitter reminder that trust was a currency far too expensive to be given lightly. Monica watched her carefully, waiting for a reaction. Finally, Simone spoke, her voice stripped of anything but grim determination. "Double security on all future operations. Vet every statement. If they want to play dirty, we'll bury them in their own lies." That night, as Simone sat alone reviewing files, a visitor came unannounced. It was the young defense attorney who had first apologized to her in the courtroom. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, a man burdened by a conscience too long suppressed. She gestured him inside, and he sat, his hands twisting nervously. "I owe you more than an apology," he began, his voice cracking slightly. I looked the other way for years. I knew things weren't right. I saw the reports. I saw the faces of the people we prosecuted on lies." Simone watched him silently, giving him the space to confront his own shame. "I stayed because I told myself I could do more from the inside," he said, the words tumbling out. "But I didn't. I just got comfortable. I got scared. And now I don't know if I deserve to be part of fixing this." Simone leaned forward, her voice low and unwavering. "You don't get to decide if you deserve redemption. You earn it. Every day. You stand up when it's hard. You speak out when it costs you everything. That's how you fix it." Tears welled in the young man's eyes, and for the first time, Simone saw not weakness but the painful birth of something stronger, resolve. As the city braced for the coming storm, with lawsuits filed, resignations submitted, and trials prepared, Simone knew the hardest battles were still ahead. There would be backlash. There would be nights when it felt like nothing had changed. There would be days when even she would wonder if it had been worth it. But there, in that room filled with flickering screens and heavy silence, she made herself a vow. She would not falter. She would not compromise. Because justice wasn't about winning easy battles. It was about fighting the impossible ones and daring to believe that sometimes, against all odds, the right thing could still prevail. And so, as the clock ticked past midnight, Simone Carter prepared herself for the next fight, not because she was fearless, but because fear would never again be enough to stop her. The morning air hung heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty as Simone Carter walked into the newly designated Operations Center, an old civic building hastily converted into a war room for justice. Charts and photographs lined the walls, each one a thread in the tangled web of corruption she and her team had spent weeks untangling. The smell of stale coffee and printer toner clung to the air, but no one complained. Every agent there moved with a grim sense of duty, their eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and the burden of a mission that grew heavier with every new revelation. As Simone stood surveying the room, Monica Reyes approached, her face a careful mask, but Simone knew her well enough to see the worry simmering underneath. Monica handed her a tablet filled with the latest reports. Arrests continued, charges mounted, and yet the resistance was growing louder, not quieter. Simone scrolled through the names, noting how many had once been considered pillars of the community, praised in ceremonies, honored with plaques and handshakes. Now their reputations crumbled like dust in the wind. "They're organizing," Monica said quietly, voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond them. "Some of the old brass, a few political allies. They're planning to discredit everything. Paint you as a rogue agent, make it look like a witch hunt instead of what it really is." Simone let the information settle into her gut. She had expected backlash, but knowing it was being orchestrated at such high levels added a new layer of pressure. She glanced up at Monica, her jaw tightening. "Then we stay ahead of them. Truth doesn't need spin. It just needs to be undeniable." Monica nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. She hesitated, then said, "There's more." Simone raised an eyebrow and waited. Monica lowered her voice even further. "They're targeting your family. Quiet threats. Subtle for now. Background checks, financial records, looking for anything they can twist." A chill ran through Simone, colder than the Michigan wind rattling the old windows. For a long moment, she said nothing, feeling the familiar weight of personal sacrifice tightening its grip around her. She thought of her parents, still living in the small Richmond neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. She thought of how proud they had been, how carefully she had shielded them from the darker realities of her work. But now the walls she had built were under siege, and the guilt pressed heavy against her ribs. Finally, she looked at Monica and said in a voice that brooked no argument, "Get a team on them. Discreet, but constant. If they so much as breathe wrong near my family, I want to know before they do." The day unfolded in relentless waves. Press conferences were hijacked by aggressive reporters spinning half-truths and conspiracy theories. Allies within the justice system grew cautious, their support cooling as political pressure mounted. Victims' families, desperate for justice yet weary from years of betrayal, demanded faster results, tangible victories. Simone understood their impatience. She carried it too, a restless urgency in her blood. But she also knew that real change wasn't a sprint. It was a siege. Late in the afternoon, she met with a coalition of community leaders. The room was packed with emotion, the air vibrating with pain and anger and guarded hope. Tanya, the woman who had lost her son, stood at the forefront, her voice unwavering as she addressed Simone. "We see what you're doing. And we're grateful. But understand this, if you leave before this is finished, if you let them shut you down or slow you down, it'll be worse for us. Because they'll make sure no one ever tries again." Simone felt the words like a blow to the chest. She rose from her chair, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "I didn't start this to walk away when it got hard. I'm not here for applause. I'm here because people deserve better than fear disguised as justice. I'm here because if no one stands up, nothing will change. I don't know how long they'll let me stay. I don't know how dirty they'll fight. But know this, as long as I'm breathing, I'm not backing down." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was something stronger, a fragile but growing belief that maybe, just maybe, the tide could be turned. That night, Simone sat in her temporary office, reviewing affidavits and witness statements. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, her muscles ached from tension, but she forced herself to keep going. Each file represented a life upended, a story that deserved to be heard. She paused over one in particular, a teenage boy wrongfully convicted of assault, his future stolen by falsified evidence and a biased judge. The boy had served 3 years before evidence exonerated him. 3 years for a crime he never committed. Simone closed the file, pressing her fingers to her temples. The knock at the door was soft, tentative. Monica entered again, carrying a folder marked confidential. Her face was grimmer than before. "We got a leak," she said. Simone tensed immediately, gesturing for her to continue. "Internal affairs. Someone flipped. They're feeding the media. You're going to be painted as a rogue agent who overstepped. They're already drafting articles, interviews with anonymous sources calling into question your methods, your authority." Simone exhaled slowly, the frustration simmering just below the surface. "And the brass?" Monica hesitated. "Divided. Some are backing you quietly. Others are preparing to distance themselves if this blows up." Simone leaned back in her chair, feeling the battle lines shifting under her feet. She had known the price of challenging the system. But knowing didn't make it any easier to pay. She stood and crossed to the window, staring out at the dark city beyond. "They think if they discredit me, the work will die with me." Monica nodded grimly. "They're betting everything on it." Simone turned back, fire sparking in her chest. "Then they're going to lose more than they bargained for. They forgot something. I didn't build this movement alone. Every person they wronged, every family they crushed, every kid they locked up without cause, they're part of this now. And they're not afraid anymore." Monica smiled, tired but genuine. "You've already changed the city. Even if they don't know it yet." Simone gave a small nod, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. Change was coming, slow and brutal and irreversible. They could smear her name, but they couldn't erase the momentum. Later, as Simone packed up for the night, she found another envelope slipped under her door. No threats this time. No warnings. Just a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message, "Thank you. You saved my life." No signature, no indication of who had sent it. Just raw, unvarnished gratitude. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket, a talisman against the battles still to come. Walking out into the cool night air, Simone paused on the steps of the federal building. The city stretched out before her, wounded but alive, bruised but breathing. She knew the fight wasn't over. She knew the storm would grow darker before the dawn. But for the first time in a long time, she also knew she wasn't standing alone. In the distance, sirens wailed, lights flickered, and somewhere deep in the heart of Detroit, a system gasped under the weight of its own reckoning. Simone Carter squared her shoulders, inhaled the cold, hard air, and stepped forward into whatever came next. Because the truth was finally free. And nothing, no smear campaign, no threat, no betrayal, could put it back in chains again. The city of Detroit woke up to a new reality in the weeks that followed the storm Simone Carter had unleashed. News outlets that once tiptoed around police misconduct now ran front-page stories exposing the rot that had festered unchecked for years. High-ranking officials who once swaggered through courtrooms were led away in handcuffs, their mugshots a grim parade of accountability. Entire precincts were gutted and rebuilt, overseen by independent review boards stacked with community advocates rather than political puppets. New training programs, policy reforms, and civilian oversight committees were put into place not as gestures, but as unshakable foundations for something better, something harder to corrupt. Officer Daniel Whitaker's downfall was nothing short of catastrophic. After a highly publicized trial that laid bare not only his own abuses but also the systemic culture that had enabled him, he was convicted on multiple counts of civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. Sentenced to serve decades in a federal prison, stripped of pension and honors, Whitaker faced a lifetime to contemplate the empire he had built on intimidation and cruelty, now reduced to dust and disgrace. Watching the verdict being read, Simone felt no triumph, only a solemn satisfaction. Justice, long delayed, was finally being served, not in vengeance but in truth. The corrupt officials who had tried to discredit her, the city attorneys, the crooked judges, the spineless supervisors, faced their own reckonings. Some were disbarred, others imprisoned, and a few, clinging to the last threads of denial, resigned quietly, their names forever tarnished in the eyes of the public. Their downfall was not dramatic, but it was thorough, each one a domino falling in a pattern too complex and inevitable for them to escape. Monica Reyes, standing beside Simone through every battle, earned a promotion that placed her in charge of leading the newly formed Integrity Division, ensuring that no future corruption could grow without fierce resistance. The young defense attorney who had once apologized to Simone became one of the key architects of legal reforms, dedicating his career to overturning wrongful convictions and providing legal defense for those the system had once crushed. His transformation was slow, painful, but genuine, a living reminder that redemption was possible for those brave enough to confront their own failures. For the community, the changes brought both relief and anger. Relief that the system was being rebuilt, anger at how long it had taken, and how much suffering had been allowed before anyone had acted. Protests continued, but now they were met not with riot shields but with open forums, dialogue, policy commitments. It wasn't perfect. Change was slow, uneven, messy. But it was real. And in that messy reality, hope found fertile ground to grow. Simone Carter, after months of relentless work, found herself standing on the courthouse steps once more. This time, not as an invisible observer, not as a woman unjustly manhandled and underestimated, but as the undeniable force of change she had always been destined to become. She wore no special badge now, no secret credentials. She didn't need them. Her power was no longer hidden. It was written in every overturned conviction, every new policy signed into law, every voice that had found courage because she had refused to back down. A reporter approached her as she prepared to leave the courthouse for the last time, microphone in hand, eyes wide with awe and curiosity. "Agent Carter," she asked, voice trembling slightly, "what do you want people to remember about all this?" Simone paused, looking out over the crowd of cameras, activists, citizens, and survivors. She thought about the cost of the battle, the sleepless nights, the fear, the loneliness, the moments of doubt. She thought about her family, who had stood steadfastly behind her even as they became targets. She thought about Jordan, the young man she had met in the holding cell, now free and planning to go to college because someone had finally believed in him. She turned back to the reporter, her voice steady, her words clear and deliberate. I want them to remember that justice isn't a gift. It's a fight. It's a choice we make every day. And it's a responsibility we can never hand off to someone else. Not if we want it to mean something. The reporter nodded, visibly moved, and the cameras captured the moment, immortalizing it in the city's collective memory. Simone walked away from the courthouse not because her mission was over, but because it was time for others to pick up the torch. She had never intended to be the hero of the story. She had only ever wanted to open the door. Now it was open wide, and the flood of truth was unstoppable. She returned home to Richmond for a while, visiting the quiet streets of her childhood, sitting with her parents on the worn porch swing as they watched the sun set over the neighborhood they had always believed in. Her father, who rarely spoke of such things, patted her hand one evening and said simply, "You did good, baby girl. You made them see." And that was enough. As for the city of Detroit, it did not transform overnight. No city could. But the seeds planted in those grueling months of investigation and reform grew roots. New leaders emerged, from the neighborhoods, from the victims' families, from the youth who had once seen no future at all. They carried forward the fight Simone had reignited, not perfectly, but persistently. And that persistence, more than anything else, was what changed the city's story. And now, dear listener, I want to leave you with something to reflect on. In Simone Carter's journey, we see a truth that echoes far beyond Detroit, far beyond one courtroom or one badge. Change is hard. It is costly. It demands sacrifice, courage, and a willingness to stand alone when standing is the hardest thing you can do. It asks us to believe that even when the world refuses to see us, even when it punishes us for daring to demand better, we still have the power to write a different ending. So I ask you, what doors will you open? What fights will you choose, even when no one else believes they can be won? How will you use your voice, your strength, your convictions, to make sure that justice is not just a word but a reality for those who come after you? If this story moved you, if it stirred something inside you, I invite you to be part of this journey with us. Subscribe to Tales of Twist to hear more stories like Simone's, stories of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up when it matters most. And if you believe in the fight for a better world, if you believe in the power of truth, hit that like button and join our community. Because every voice matters. And your voice can change everything.